So thank you all for coming. I'm Anthony Hadd. I think I know most of you. I don't know all of you. And as you might be aware, college chambers, so my chambers, we do an awful lot of care work. The way that my practice works, most of my work is down in Bournemouth. Just works out that way. But we have practitioners that work a lot in Portsmouth, some that just work in Bournemouth, and some that float between the two. Now, tonight I'm going to talk about non-accidental injuries because that's really what I've been doing mostly this year. Looking back at this year, I would have thought probably about 90% of my work's been non-accidental injury cases. So where have they all come from? I'm not sure where all this growth has come from. Anyway, let's just see if I can make this work. Okay. So we're going to look at the 3 Bs. So we thought that was probably brain injury, broken bones, and bruising. Now, I was told to say something funny at the start of the talk. I'm useless at telling jokes. My kids are much better at telling jokes. So I thought I'd show cute photographs of my children instead, because I'm a very proud dad. So that's my kids, and it's the kids that did the PowerPoint. So, because I can't do it on my own. They put in a picture of the dog, but the dog, you can't really see him. This apparently is Mum. I didn't notice that my wife looked like that, but there you go. Apparently this is me. That's John Barrowman. You can't see that. They haven't worked out that maybe if they had John Barrowman for Dad and Kylie Minogue for Mum, probably they wouldn't be there. But there you go. Now, force equals ma, which is Newton's second law, which is where we're going to start. Oh, no, go back to Newton's second law. There we go. So, one of my very first non-accidental injury cases. So we're now going back to the early 1990s. I was very young, and I was very scared doing a non-accidental injury case, especially because there was a silk involved as well, so it was all quite new. I was acting for father. The silk was representing Mum. And it was a small baby, and there were fractured ribs. And the thinking on fractured ribs for small babies is basically, if you've got fractured ribs for small babies, it's non-accidental injury. Forget having a defence, forget it. It's just going to be non-accidental injury. We'll return to that. But on the facts of this one, there was a radiologist who's now retired, and she was saying, sorry, it can only be non-accidental injury. I don't accept mother and father's explanation. They just really must have done something really bad and squeezed the ribs. So the silk on behalf of Mum had a good go at this radiologist, and it didn't produce anything. She was sticking to her story. It must be non-accidental injury. And this Mum came forward into the well of the court, and she had the doll representing the baby on her chest, and she gave an explanation of what happened, which was she had the baby late one night, she was holding it on her chest, she drank a bit too much, she tripped over and she'd fallen onto the floor with the baby underneath her. And the radiologist was saying, no, sorry, falls, that won't do it. If it's broken ribs, it has to be non-accidental injury. So, like I was saying, this was one of my first cases, so bear that in mind. And I heard about the reputation of this radiologist, and she was quite fearsome. And she had a reputation for saying everything was non-accidental injury. And it was just before her retirement, so she's a radiologist, I don't know, with about 40 years worth of experience. But I thought to myself, I've got a B in O-level physics, and I'm going to use it. So, I said to her, look, it's about force then. How do you define force? And she said, well, I'm a radiologist. I don't deal with force, which is slightly circular, really. If she's saying, look, there wasn't enough force to cause the injuries. So I said, what's Newton's second law? And the radiologist gave me a weird look, and the judge gave me an even weirder look. And I said, well, look, it's force equals mass times acceleration. And on the facts of this case, it's relevant because if you're talking about the mass of the baby, which is, let's say, 3 kilograms, acceleration hitting the floor is going to be, well, acceleration is going to be speed of gravity, so about 9 meters a second. So, okay, radiologist, if you're thinking about dropping a baby on his own, it's not going to cause the injury. But if it's the combined weight of the baby and the mother, so the mother's going on top of the baby, so instead of it being 3 kilograms, it's probably 63 kilograms, then the amount of force is suddenly increased by a factor of 20. And then she said, oh, I hadn't thought about it in that way. And she gave way and she said, yeah, it's an accidental injury because the mother had just tripped over. So I thought, well, okay, I can do this thing with non-accidental injuries. And it encouraged me to have an inquiring mind about how it works. Now, a good example of an inquiring mind also about how lawyers work through these things is that recently we've been doing a fact find with a number of silks involved. And the collagen testing for the baby wasn't right. The collagen results were low. And collagen makes tissues, tissues make bone. So the silk for mum was saying, well, look, we've got a terrible problem here. This baby must have malformed bones because the collagen isn't right. So we went down that route with various experts for about 3 days, and then we got the haematologist into the witness box and we said, well, look, what about this collagen testing? And he said, yeah, that's the laboratory collagen that we mix the blood with. It's got nothing to do with the collagen of the baby. So you can't take things too far. So types of abuse. So we know about physical abuse, non-accidental injury, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and according to this survey, about 28% of abuse in care proceedings is physical abuse. As I say, at the moment, I'm seeing a lot more physical abuse than 28%. And why is there more non-accidental injury than there used to be? That's the way I feel about it in Dorset. In Hampshire, do you think there's more non-accidental injury going around at the moment? Certainly in Birmingham. I was up in Birmingham over the course of the summer, and they were saying, no, it's the opposite. There's less non-accidental injury around. So maybe it's just something about Dorset. I don't know. Right, so just to get the terms right for... And I can see I've got a mixture. I've got a mixture of old hands. I've got a mixture of quite new people. So NAI is non-accidental injury. Non-accidental injury doesn't necessarily mean intentional injury. So it can include recklessness. Doctors don't think of it that way. Doctors think of NAI as intentional injury. So there's that slight tension there. A good example of non-accidental injury that wasn't intended, recklessness, was I had a case where the father was saying, well, I like to spend some time on my own with the baby. And he gave this account from the witness box that what he liked to do was to go in and see his baby, who was about 3 months old, and just to throw him up into the air, just very gently, let him drop. The baby enjoyed it. Anyway, Mum went out one evening, so Dad thought, it's a good time, let's do some bonding. So he went into the baby's bedroom. He didn't want to wake the baby up, so he left the lights off, because it's nicer to leave the lights off, it's more restful that way. And he thought he would still do the throwing up in the air game. And his explanation was, well, I threw the baby up, and this time the baby didn't come down. I was saying, look, I really can't work this one out. So we went through what I called in cross-examination, because I was getting a bit flippant, the science of throwing babies. And I was saying, look, when I had my babies, you just, right, you do throw them perhaps up in the air, but maybe 1 or 2 inches, but that's it. And he was saying, no, I was getting a good 2 or 3 feet on it. And he said, well, yeah, it was quite dark. And so the explanation was, yeah, well, I did throw the baby. It must have been about 2 or 3 feet. And the baby, yes, I agree, the baby must have come down due to gravity, but the baby didn't come down near me. That was the problem. But after taking it through, that did cause the injuries. It was such a mad story. I think he must have been telling the truth about that, and he was such a peculiar guy. I couldn't think that he would have done anything else. But that's just to highlight that non-accidental injury, which that was, doesn't actually mean that you have to intend to harm the child. NAHI, non-accidental head injury, as we're going to have a look in a moment, head injuries to children. So shaken baby syndrome, as was, that's now bad. It's now all encompassed under NAHI, non-accidental head injury. Anterior is your front, posterior is your back, lateral is sides. Distal normally applies to arms and legs. So if we're talking about a break in a distal femur, it's the end of your femur closest to the knee because it's the furthest part from your heart. So that makes it distal. Proximal is the top of your femur, so it will be the part closest to your heart. And acute and chronic don't actually have the normal English common sense meaning. Acute probably means recent, chronic is historic, and then foot bone's connected to the leg bone because you've got to have a light-hearted view. Right, there's 3 questions in non-accidental injury cases. Was the injury a non-accidental injury is the first one, and you've got to consider the when, the why, and the how. And then, if so, on a balance of probabilities, who was the perpetrator? And lastly, if a specific perpetrator cannot be identified, then who are in the pool of possible perpetrators? We're going to work through that. We're going to start off with head injury, but at the moment, let's just look at, was the injury a non-accidental injury, when and how? So going to the handout for one moment, which should start Non-Accidental Injury Care Lecture, Autumn 2012. Well, it starts off with Re-H&R. Re-H&R is always the starting point on the balance of probabilities. And as Lord Nichols said, the balance of probability standard means that a court is satisfied an event occurred if the court considers that on the evidence, the occurrence of the event was more likely than not. Now, I know this is an old case. I know a lot of you know it, but I just want to highlight 2 points from it. The first is, and there has been a change, in Re-H&R, Lord Nichols goes on, 6th line down, to say the more serious the allegation, the less likely it is that the event occurred. Now, people still keep saying that. If you're doing a case, don't say that anymore. We've had 2 more House of Lords decisions where we've had Re-B in the House of Lords and Re-S-B in the Supreme Court. That bit's gone. Seriousness is gone. The other reason why I highlight it is, although we've had Re-H&R in 1996, if you turn over the page, we've got Re-B from 2008. In 2008, it must still have been House of Lords, I think. And then we get Re-S-B, which is page 5 of the handout, Baroness Hale. Again, all going over the same issue. There's another case just about to go to the House of Lords on Re-H&R grounds. I was speaking to one of the silks involved. He said he thought it was coming on in November, so any time now. Equally, he thought it might be adjourned until February. But let's wait and see if the House of Lords or the Supreme Court have a bash at this and come to a different conclusion. So non-accidental head injury. Victims of non-accidental head injury have a 13 to 33% chance of death and a 50% chance of significant neurological impairment. Now, I bear that in mind because the last non-accidental head injury I did last month, it was being said there, well, actually, in the context of non-accidental head injury cases, this isn't such a serious case. Well, that particular case wasn't, but if you think that 50% of them have a significant chance of neurological impairment, then that really puts things into perspective. Injuries that involve bleeding to the brain are the leading cause of death of babies who have been abused. Interestingly, in my care case this week, I learned that the second highest cause of babies who have been abused, their death, is apparently bruising to the abdomen. I didn't think of that one. It's estimated that 1 in 3,000 babies of less than 6 months suffer NAHI. And then going back to my question, which was why is there more non-accidental head injury, non-accidental injury than there used to be? According to an NSPCC study, 64% of non-accidental head injuries to smaller children occur in families in the most economically deprived areas of society. And I think that's startling, really. If you think about 2/3 of them are within, well, I don't know, the bottom 3% economically of society. I think that speaks for itself. And a study in East London, 1 in 9 mothers said they had shaken their baby. It's almost a bit like Family Fortunes, isn't it? 1 in 9 mothers. But 1 in 9 mothers say they had shaken their baby, and 2 out of 9 said they felt like shaking their babies. So maybe the recession is having an effect. Right. Shaken baby syndrome, SBS. Forget it as a term. It's old law, it's bad news, it's now non-accidental head injury, but we're talking essentially about the same thing. We're talking about shaking a baby, or alternatively for NAHI you can have included trauma, so a blow to the head. The medical components are varied and they can include retinal hemorrhage, subdural or subarachnoid hemorrhage, fracture, and external physical findings. One of the things I found when I started off on non-accidental injury cases is getting used to the language is a bit difficult. So hemorrhage is just a collection of blood. So retinal hemorrhage is a collection of blood in the eye where it shouldn't be. Subdural or subarachnoid hemorrhage. That's the brain. So if you think of the brain, I think of a brain as a cauliflower. And I always use plastic bags for this explanation. I'm never entirely sure why. But if you've got your cauliflower, that's the brain. There's 3 plastic bags. There's the first plastic bag, which is the pia mater. There's 3 membranes that go around the brain to protect it. There's the pia mater. Then there's the arachnoid lining, and then there's the dura. And beyond the dura, you get to the bony bit, the cranium. So if there is a subdural hemorrhage, it's a collection of blood where it shouldn't be between the dura, so the top lining, and the arachnoid lining, so the second lining. If it's a subarachnoid hemorrhage, it's a hemorrhage between the arachnoid membrane and the pia mater. In terms of how do you prevent in society non-accidental head injury, SBS that was, it's very difficult. Public knowledge would be a good thing. It never ceases to amaze me how many people in care proceedings don't know that it's a bad idea to shake the baby. The bottom bullet point. Many people confessed they believe shaking an infant for discipline or during vigorous play could not harm the child in such a devastating way. Now, we're told from the cases, from the experts, that vigorous play, if you're bouncing the baby on your knee, jiggling him up and down, it's not going to cause a subdural hemorrhage. But there again, going back to earlier on this year, it's how far you take it. I did a fact find where Mum was an intelligent lady. She had a degree. Dad was an intelligent man as well, not to the same level as Mum was, but the baby had significant subdural hemorrhages, and the police got hold of Mum's iPhone, and on Mum's iPhone there were various video clips of Dad in the pub, and Mum had taken the clips, and it starts off as jiggling, but then the child is shaken so hard that the head is going backwards and forwards so quickly that it's just a blur. And then the baby gets sick, and that happened 3 or 4 times, and that was the play. And the experts were saying, well, no, probably that wasn't bad enough, but if they just went up to the next stage in terms of vigorousness, that probably would have caused the injuries. So I think that also goes to the category of, well, some people just don't know what they're doing. And I think this couple really did believe in this play, but it had disastrous context for that little girl who's profoundly damaged. I think this slide's a bit odd, actually, in the way that it's drawn, because it looks like they're Siamese twins, but it's not. The idea is concentrating on non-accidental head injury again, that to create the hemorrhages in the brain, you're going to need a rotational force of the fluid within the brain. So shaking a baby backwards and forwards like that is how they say it happens, but it's got to be vigorous. I couldn't work out in my own mind why shaking a baby backwards and forwards was going to produce a rotational force. So the 10-year-olds who did the PowerPoint decided they would do an experiment. And we got a lemonade bottle and we filled it with water. And we found that if you say that the lemonade bottle filled with water represents a brain, we didn't put it in quite such graphic detail to the 10-year-olds, but they got the idea. If you do shake it backwards and forwards, you do get a rotational force. It's like water going down a plug hole. Curiously, it only spins anti-clockwise. No matter how many times we did it, the water would only go anti-clockwise. So if you shake a baby in the southern hemisphere, does the blood go round the other way? I don't know. But that's the way it happens. So in terms of the damage that can be done, so if we go back to the statistic, 50% of shaken babies have neurological loss. You can have permanent brain damage, hydrocephalus, developmental delay. It's the developmental delay that I think I've seen the most. Blindness, deafness, paralysis, mental retardation. The baby that was shaken by mum and dad in the pub with the iPhone certainly had the developmental delay, the blindness and the deafness. But happily, I'm told, in her adoptive placement, she is a very happy child, which is great. So this is how you diagnosed whether there has been a shaken baby or not. You're going to need an awful lot of experts. You're going to need an ophthalmologist to deal with the retinal hemorrhages. You're going to need evidence from a neuroradiologist. You're going to need evidence probably from a neurosurgeon and maybe from a paediatrician also. It goes along with what was called, still is called, the triad. Now the triad isn't really explained there, but for a shaken baby, there's three factors. If you have those three factors, it's usually indicative of the baby being shaken. So you need a subdural or subarachnoid hemorrhage, so a bleed to the brain. You need the retinal hemorrhage, and then you need some disturbance in brain function or encephalopathy. And the idea is, the reason why it happens is that if there is a bleed to the brain or the bleed to the membranes of the brain, that's going to create pressure where there shouldn't be pressure. That's going to press down on the brain, and that's going to create the disturbance in brain function. And the longer that disturbance in brain function goes on, the more damaged the child is going to be. In some cases, you're going to get a shunt. So in hospital, they're going to put a shunt into the head to try to withdraw the fluid. That's also relevant in terms of timing of the injury. I don't think many people know that. But if there has been a shunt and it's withdrawn fluid from the brain, sometimes, if you can get a good account of the colour of the fluid, that will tell you how long ago the shake was. And I forget which colour it is, but they say that basically the fluid will normally look like engine oil if you withdraw it. If it looks, I think it's a more yellow colour, then it means that the shake was a significant period ago. But finding the evidence on that one's very difficult, because when the doctors are withdrawing the fluid, they're generally not looking to see what colour it is. CT scans in hospital is normally the way that they will diagnose a shake, and there should be a CT scan normally within the first 24 hours. But from our point of view, clinical presentation is the point that I think most people need to watch for, in terms of, if you're acting for a local authority, what were the parents saying? If you're acting for the parents, what are the parents saying about when this child became ill? And what we're told is that after a child has been shaken, to the middle bullet point, bulging fontanelle, so that's the soft part on the top of the baby's head, so that's going to become raised but that one's often difficult to pick up. A lot of paediatricians don't necessarily pick up a bulging fontanelle. Vomiting, irritability, seizures, poor feeding, failure to thrive. I've never really worked it out, but it seems to be a common theme that poor feeding is one of the most clear indicative factors of when the shake had taken place. The idea is that a shaken baby, we're told, will not feed properly after being shaken. So if you go back to the last time the baby fed well, then we assume the baby's well at that point. And bruising is exceptional. Moving beyond that one. Sorry, I just want to get to we'll get there. Right. When did the non-accidental injury happen? So this is a real case, but let's try and work it through. So remember, the signs and the symptoms are that there's a disturbance in brain function. So you're the judges. We've got the case that the child is well on a Friday night and the baby fed well. So going back to what I said, that's normally a good indicator the child hadn't been shaken by that point. Saturday morning, good feed whilst with the mum. Following the feed, starts to scream. Scream is like a scream never heard before. How many times have we heard that in all these reports? We get scream is like a scream never heard before. Baby's upset all morning. Parents think it's colic. Baby is floppy, no head control. So not a normal baby, but baby could have colic, I suppose. Lunchtime, placed in a car seat and the baby smiles. Baby smiling, is that relevant? Could it be wind? Is it really a smile? 2 p.m, baby at... Oh, we're joining BT Opens there. There we go. 2 p.m, baby at grandma's house. Mother and maternal grandmother go shopping, as you do when your baby's been shaken. Baby left with father, baby is asleep, wakes up from sleep and screams as if someone is murdering her. So earlier we had scream like never heard before. Later in the afternoon we've got scream like someone's murdering her. Baby's floppy and unresponsive. Grandma at 3 p.m. is looking after the baby. The baby goes rigid, the eyes roll, arms and legs go rigid, there's a mini fit. 4 p.m. the ambulance is called. Now, if you're the judge trying to work out when the shake was, and that's going to be highly relevant because we've had mother, let's say, we have got mother giving the feed at 8 o'clock in the morning. We've got father looking after the baby at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We've got grandma looking after the baby at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You've got to try and work out who did it and when. And it's not easy. And on the facts of this one, does anyone want to venture a guess when the baby was shaken on that timeline? Well, on the facts of this one, we had one expert saying it had to be at 0.5, which is when the baby wakes from the sleep and screams as if someone was murdering her, because that was worse than the scream at number 2 at 8 o'clock in the morning. And the thinking was the baby's going to scream the loudest just after it's been shaken. We had another expert who said, well, look, the relevant time is going to be any time after 0.4, the smile, because you need to use a lot of brain power for your baby to smile. And so if the baby had been shaken, she wouldn't be smiling. And then we had the other expert who was saying, well, it could have been any time after 8 o'clock in the morning when the child is fed by mum and then starts to scream. So it's very difficult to work these things out. Experts are going to contradict themselves. But I suppose all the more reason to get a clear account from mum and dad, if you possibly can, about what happened and when. The judge on that one decided that it wasn't grandma because a number of bad things had happened before that point, but couldn't decide whether it was mum or dad. Before we go to bones, back to the legal handout, just for one moment. and it's page 6, Islington and Ray, and alas. So, Islington, Ray and alas was, I'm trying to think of the judge's name. Bear with me, it will come back to me. I used to do domestic violence injunctions against her in Basingstoke 20 years ago, and I can see her in my mind in Basingstoke. Mrs. Justice Tice. Paragraphs 8 to 14 of Ray and alas are brilliant. They're a great summary of what the law is. It starts off with the burden of proof is on the local authority, but then there's all the cautions that go in there. So, for example, at paragraph 9, there's the quote from Crown against Harris, the triad. So remember, the triad was the hemorrhage within the linings of the brain, the hemorrhage to the retina, the disturbance in brain function, becomes central to a diagnosis of non-accidental head injury when there are no other signs or symptoms of trauma, such as bruises or fractures. So triad's really important. Whilst a strong pointer to non-accidental head injury on its own, we do not think it is possible to find that the triad must automatically and necessarily lead to a diagnosis of non-accidental head injury. So remember, even if you've got the triad, it doesn't mean necessarily this child's been shaken. All the circumstances must be taken into account. At paragraph 10 of Ray and alas, it's always open to a judge to rule that the cause of an injury remains unknown. And then an important quote from Riar, setting out that, well, a judge not being able to find whether it was a non-accidental injury or not, perhaps is the most the judge can do on any particular situation. Paragraph 11 of Ray and alas quotes from Ryu, 6th line down, that the court has to take into account the wide canvas. And then going over to paragraph 12, just flagging up again that in terms of the medical science, there are areas of ignorance. It is very easy to try and fill those areas of ignorance with what we know, but I think it is very important to accept that we do not necessarily have a sufficient understanding to explain every case. And then if you go over the page, just before paragraph 14, the end of paragraph 13, the judge in care proceedings must never forget that today's medical certainty may be discarded by the next generation of experts, or that scientific research will throw light into corners that are at present dark. Ray and alas is an excellent summary of the law as we have it, particularly with non-accidental head injuries. The amount of times when I go home in the evening, I'm in the kitchen, I'm making my tea, I'm thinking back on what I've done that day, we've had the expert saying, yes, it must be a non-accidental injury. The amount of times, though, that I found that they're saying, yeah, it's non-accidental injury, but in my own mind they're saying it for completely contradictory reasons. And the amount of times I just wonder that in 10 years' time, if science is going to move on and they're going to say what we think is non-accidental injury isn't non-accidental injury. Wide canvas, which was one of the points in alas, the context of that, if that phrase isn't clear to you, is that for the judge, the medical evidence is just one component, a very important component, but if he wholeheartedly believes the parents, he can disregard the medical evidence. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Right, bones, fractures. I always have, in a major case, a printout of the skeleton, because I need to mark on my skeleton where the fractures are, because I can't remember. We're going to concentrate on rib fractures. Rib fractures to young babies. There is, there we go, an X-ray with lots of rib fractures. There is a wealth of studies about rib fractures to babies. If you're acting for a parent, they're all pretty negative. I'm sorry about that. So, for example, there's a study that looks at CPR on babies. And so doctors trained in CPR are trained to compress the rib cage to at least a compression of a third in the capacity of the rib cage. So if we're going from there, we're going to probably go down to there, if not further. And for CPR, that's going to be basically, I've got staying alive going through my brain now. You'll know the reason why. So I'm guessing the compression is about every second, every 2 seconds, something like that. And the rib compression can go on in CPR for up to an hour. So we're literally talking about hundreds or thousands, perhaps, of compressions to a baby's rib cage. So from the study on CPR, 950 cases of small babies with CPR, only 3 of those babies had a fractured rib. So if you put it in that context, that's literally thousands of very serious compressions on the ribs of small babies. They don't generally produce rib fractures. But there's another study, and if you're interested, I'll give you the reference for it, which basically says, well, unless there's a medical reason for something to be wrong with this child, if it's a rib fracture in a baby, it has to be non-accidental injury. But there's an awful lot of care cases with rib fractures that go on. This diagram is interesting for 2 points. Firstly, if you think about a hoop, think about a hoop. If you're pressing these sides of the hoop, it's not going to break where you're pressing it. It's going to break at the opposite ends. So similarly, if you're pressing this way on a hoop, it's going to break at this part. So we've got the back of the baby where the spine is. That person's thumb is on their front chest. And so the fractures are going to be lateral fractures down the side because that's the point that's going to be most under stress. Anterior, so front rib fractures, are most likely a sign of impact as opposed to being squeezed, but they could be both. Posterior, those at the back, are basically compression, so squeezing. They can't really be anything else. Small babies lie on their back, they don't fall on their back. Curiously, we heard from an expert this week, a very well-renowned expert. He's been chairman of the National Society of Radiologists, chairman of the European Society of Radiologists, giving evidence about posterior rib fractures. And he says the way to get a posterior rib fracture is, so if I'm holding the baby and the baby's looking at me, I've got to not only got to squeeze, but I've also got to be moving my hand around towards the back to sort of get an arching area to squeeze in on the backbone to get a rib fracture. I wonder how many people, when they get angry with babies, actually do that movement, but there you go. The expert says that's how you get a posterior rib fracture. Osteopenia of prematurity. I didn't know much about this one until about a year ago. This time last year, I had a client who was very sweet. She was the mum of this baby. She'd been desperate to have this baby. Her boyfriend, he wasn't such a nice guy, but we've seen much worse. The problem they had was their baby had 20 fractures. In police interview, it was suggested that someone had stomped on the baby. That's the only way that the baby could have had 20 fractures. We were coming up to the fact-finding hearing that was set down for 3 weeks. And Mum said, well, look, it could be osteopenia of prematurity. My baby was born very early. And for osteopenia of prematurity, you're probably looking at a baby born somewhere between 24 to 28 weeks. By the time they get into the 30-week category, it's probably not going to be relevant. And this baby had been born at 29 weeks, so all right, just outside the normal window. But there was nothing to indicate that there was osteopenia for this child. As I say, we're a couple of weeks from the final hearing. There was a gap in the medical disclosure. We get more medical disclosure. The hospital said, no, you've had it all. Needless to say, they produced some more. And on the medical disclosure that they produced, there was another X-ray of when the child was very small in hospital. The child had been in hospital for a while because he'd been born so early. And that showed some rib fractures in hospital, presumably through normal handling. So the expert said, well, it's osteopenia of prematurity. And what happens is that a really premature baby at about 3 months old, or thereabouts, the calcium is taken out from their bones, and it's diverted to other parts of their body, and you get a weakness in the bones. Now, we ran that case, and yeah, the experts decided, well, yeah, this child probably did have osteopenia of prematurity. But let's say 2 of the fractures were due to osteopenia, but 18 weren't, so we're still up a gum tree. The interesting point that we learned from that case was, firstly, once you get a diagnosis of osteopenia, on the literature, the child is susceptible to other fractures for perhaps up to 2 years after the osteopenia came on. So after the bones ostensibly become normal, you could have reduced force to fracture. Also, osteopenia basically means that the bones are hollowed out, the calcium's taken out, they have a hollow appearance on the X-ray, and the bones generally fill in over quite a quick period of time and appear normal on the X-ray. But the X-rays themselves will only show a bone that has filled into, let's say, 60% of maximum. Once a bone has filled into 60% of maximum, then it's going to look like a normal bone on an X-ray. So you get this grey area. Are those bones on the X-rays 60% of their strength? Are they 100% of their strength? Somewhere in between. Apparently, if it's somewhere in between, so let's say 70%, there is no study to say how much force would be required to fracture those bones. Could it be normal handling? Nobody knows. And I think the other point of interest is that if the bones have osteopenia, then the research says that the time for the bone to heal, which is how radiologists normally date fractures, that would take much longer to try and work out. So that could be completely wrong. So for bones, the points to look at the moment in particular are vitamin D deficiency, but you need to, vitamin D deficiency, so rickets. Vitamin K deficiency, also vitamin C deficiency. There's an argument about whether scurvy can or cannot lead to a weakness in bones. Brittle bone disorder and osteopenia. Bruising, very briefly. As I say, the kids did this. They thought this picture of this guy with his bruise was fun. So for bruising, if you're acting for a parent, what you're going to need to know is there a history of bruising or not? And again, I suppose the way my practice has changed is that this history of bruising lot, 10 years ago, I really wouldn't have paid too much of attention to it. This year, I've had a number of people that have said, yeah, we do have a history of bruising in the family. They've gone off to be tested, and there is some deficiency in the blood that does indicate that maybe the child, if the deficiency has been passed on, could have bruised more easily than usual. So it's worth getting it checked out. Different question completely. In the handout is a case re-S. Intervening. So, mums, dads are going to be parties to your care proceedings. Let's say mum has a new boyfriend who is not the father. He was in the house, as was mum, on the evening when the injuries occurred. Should new boyfriend intervene or not? I'm often asked that question. I haven't said don't intervene yet. I think people should intervene. The problem if you don't intervene is, well, findings can be made against you. And then under the CPR, Part 23, Part 24, Part 25, it's in the 20s. You can apply to set aside the finding if you weren't a party, but I suppose the judge at a set-aside application is going to be saying, well, look, if you could have intervened, you should have intervened. So intervening, if you're accused of causing injuries, is the right way about it. But I think the practical problem is getting funding. It's not really available for legal aid, especially if the boyfriend has a job. He's going to have difficulty getting legal aid. But RES says, yeah, give it a go, intervene. Right, so now we're moving on to, let's say the judge says, yes, it was a non-accidental injury, the whodunit part. This has changed. in the last couple of years. So it goes back to Re-SB, which is Baroness Hale on page 5. I'm not going to read out the whole portion of the judgment that goes from page 5 to 6 to 7. But in essence, what Baroness Hale was saying is, after you found out that it was non-accidental injury, the next question is, you have to work out who the perpetrator was. Well, that's logical, but I think there's a step in between, which is you work out who's the pool of perpetrators, who's in the pool of possible perpetrators. Baroness Hale says no, that actually comes afterwards. So you start off by saying, who was the perpetrator, who was the most likely person to have caused the injuries, which, as I say, I think you need to work out who was in the pool first of possible perpetrators. Just 2 points on that. Page 7 of the handout is the end of Baroness Hale, quoting from the North Yorkshire case. So Dame Elizabeth Butler Sloss. And she points out again, I think most of you know it, but I just emphasise it again, because the amount of time that in cases people let this one pass by. The test is no longer the no possibility test. So it used to be, if you had any conduct to do with a child, let's say you were a taxi driver employed to take the child to and from school. You were in the pool at that point, and you would only get out of the pool of possible perpetrators if you could prove, so the onus is on you, to prove that there was no possibility that you could have caused these injuries. The test is slightly different now. The emphasis is the other way. It's rather, only the people in the pool are those who had a likelihood or a real possibility of causing the injuries. So, for example, if we can work out that there's a particular 24 hours in which the injuries must have been caused, the child is in mum's care throughout the day, but mum pops out for 10 minutes to go to the Tesco supermarket round the corner, and then she comes back and the child is happy, I would say there's no real possibility that a significant injury has been done in that time and for the child to have got over that distress. So boyfriend, if he's looking after the child in that 10 minutes, isn't in the pool. The other point that I would take you to on pool and also identification of perpetrator is at page 6, which is Re D. Top of page 6, we've got Re D quoted with approval as part of Re-SB. And what Re D says is the court shouldn't strain to find who the perpetrator is. I was in Re D for the local authority, and what we had was mum, who on the one hand was very caring, on the other hand had the opportunity to cause the injuries more than anyone else. Re D's a Dorset case. But also she was absolutely rubbish in giving her evidence, and no one could really work out why she wasn't terribly consistent in her accounts. Compared to, on the other hand, a dad who was violent, domestic violence and drugs, but limited possibility, limited opportunity to cause the injuries. Some, but it boiled down to, well, I looked after the child when mum was in the shower, but that was it. The Court of Appeal said, well, actually the right course on those facts was not to say that it was mum that did it or dad that did it, but rather to leave both mum and dad in the pool, so you can't identify a specific perpetrator, and say that all you can do is to say it must have been mum or dad. Just to update, then, not in the handout, there's a case on bruising. I don't know if you've got any bruising cases coming up. If so, wait a couple of weeks if you can. Re-M on bruising has just been decided. Re-M is a case where there was a whole load of bruising to a small baby. All the experts said, yes, it must be non-accidental injury. The Court of Appeal have let mum and dad off to say, well, look, we accept that it is accidental injury. I say wait a couple of weeks because the head note's on Lawtel, but the actual transcript of the judgment isn't on Lawtel. And just lastly, going back to the handout just for one moment, a couple of other useful cases that I found across the course of the last year. Page 12 of the handout, well, actually start at page 10. Page 10 is re-CD. Re-CD is well known for highlighting all the cautions that judges should make in non-accidental injury cases, such as, well, got to be careful about the science, got to be careful if there's a conflict in medical evidence. If I believe mum and dad, well, if I really believe them, I can discard the medical evidence. As I say, that rarely happens. But re-CD is also useful because in re-CD, there was a fracture to the femur, upper leg bone, largest bone in the body. We are told that if a child fractures their femur, they're going to know about it and you are going to know about it. Just to diverge for one moment. Going back to interveners for a moment. I've done a couple of cases where I act for hospitals and they're brought in as interveners into care proceedings because parents say, well, it must be the hospital that caused the injuries. And I've had a run of obstetricians who, the allegation is that, well, it's the obstetrician that caused the injuries at birth, it wasn't me. And I had a very sweet obstetrician in Birmingham who was saying, well, yeah, I've broken a few bones in my time, but I know I break them because they go click at the time. But there you go. Re-CD is also useful because it was a fracture to a femur. The judge accepted that there was something special about this baby that meant that she wouldn't necessarily give the normal pain response. So this cry like I've never been heard before, the judge said, well, look, I suspect there's just something about this baby. She's got an abnormal pain tolerance. So when the doctor was examining the baby, he might have fractured the baby's leg at that point in time. We don't know. Because the baby didn't cry at that moment in time, didn't mean it didn't happen in the examination. Lastly, Lancashire County Council, D&E, page 12. If you're acting for parents, well, that's the one. I think it's the only one that I've really come across that says, well, look, I'm going to go with and make a finding that even though the experts say it's non-accidental injury, I'm going to believe these parents and say no. I'm going to look at the wider canvas and say it was an accidental injury and not a non-accidental injury. So that concludes my lecture. Oh, hold on, there's another slide. They thought questions would be useful. Questions, so come on, any questions at all? If not, that's the last slide from the kids. They thought, well, time to eat cake. I don't think there is actually cake. I'm told it's actually savoury food. I'm sorry about that. But thank you for coming. I think the food is being served downstairs. Upstairs. Right. Upstairs in 5 minutes. Right, we've got food in 5 minutes. You've got to ask me questions now for 5 minutes.
Anthony?
Yeah.
On the child injury to the triad,
yeah.
The subretinal hemorrhage and also the brain damage or brain function. Why do you also need the retina hemorrhage? Why is it all fully to?
In short, that's probably a good question for a neurosurgeon. But the one I did last, we had the ophthalmologist who was doing her damnedest to say it couldn't be shaken baby. She thought it was a platelet disorder, so something to do with the child's blood. But there was a retinal hemorrhage, and she was reluctant to agree that it could have been a shake. And we extrapolated it backwards, that the retinal hemorrhage must have been caused by an increase in pressure within the brain. So I think it goes back to the rotational forces that go on within the brain, and the greater the pressure, the more likely it is that it's going to cause other forms of injury, such as retinal. But it's a question for an expert. The only other thing, then on brain injury, while we're just talking about brain injury for one moment while we're waiting for the food to come, is that if there are hemorrhages at one site, that's more likely to be impact, because if you think a baby falling on its head, it's going to have a hemorrhage on the side that it's fallen on. If it's multifocal, to use the lingo, so various points, it's more likely to be shaking because of the rotational forces. Carl, give me another question. Well, thank you for coming anyway. If you hang around, there'll be some food in a minute. Thank you.
Some wine.